Welcome to our spring fling of blog books today. So, we got a whole bunch of stuff to go through today, so I want to get started fast with some of the fun stuff. This, coffee table books. Does anybody even have coffee tables anymore? I don't know. But coffee table books are always fun. And we have several of them that have come in recently, and I'm going to talk about two of them that I really liked. Harper's Bazaar Models, which is kind of a history of the famous supermodels that have graced Harper's Bazaar I think it's been around for close to 100 years. And great biographies and beautiful pictures and stuff that isn't dated, and everybody from Carmen to and Cindy Crawford to all kinds of models, but it's a really nice book. The only thing that I thought was weird about this book is Twiggy isn't in it. And I know Twiggy was on the cover of Harper's Bazaar many times. And we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of Twiggy, who is, for some people, a role model. Maybe not a good one, but still a role model. She changed fashion. Should have been in here. But it's a fun read. I liked it a lot. Next book started as a project. A young photographer contacted Elizabeth Taylor and said, I'd like to take some pictures of your house. And Ms. Taylor, who didn't really let people into her private home in California, said, okay. And then during the time that she was making the photographs, Ms. Taylor died. So it's kind of a record of her house. And you can see, and I'll show you, this is on her shelf in her bedroom. You see that there's an award here, right? I think it's right in here somewhere. But there's also a lot of family photos and a lot of things that her grandchildren made for her, and some of her jewelry. And that's how her house really was. It's glamour, it's Hollywood, there's Oscars, and yet there's, clay figures that her grandkids made for her. And her kitchen, which she cooked in. And I love Elizabeth Taylor anyway because I think she was one of the last of the Hollywood broads, and a movie star in the true sense of a movie star. And it's a wonderful book to just look through and look at some of her stuff, and just kind of a bygone era that will be. And that the title is the address of where she lived in Los Angeles. And the house, by the way, is for sale, and a lot of her stuff has gone up for auction. A story about Elizabeth Taylor is, there's a great documentary called Last Days at Chasen's about the famous Hollywood restaurant. And when Chasen's closed, Elizabeth Taylor ordered 100 gallons of their chili to be frozen so that she would always have Chasen's chili. And recently they had an AIDS benefit where they had a dinner, and the first thing they served was Chasen's chili recipe for the dinner in honor of Elizabeth Taylor. Okay, enough of that. Speaking of food, many of you probably watched John Besh on IPTV because he has a regular show. This is his new book. I like Besh because he is a chef. He owns like 6 restaurants, very technical cook, but yet he talks about, in all of his cookbooks and on his TV shows, he talks about how you can relate this to family, and how cooking is really not a chore, it's not a duty, it's something you do when you love your family and when you love your friends and when you want to show them how to enjoy food. And this is a really nice love letter to New Orleans, as he would say, where he lives and has 3 or 4 of his restaurants. And some really great old-fashioned recipes. And I notice a lot of it's called old food, is coming back. And Beshy's got a couple of them in here. And I really, really like this book. I don't usually talk about cookbooks, but I really like this one. Okay, we'll go to politics now. So, hell burns brighter because Richard Nixon's there. That's what I like to say. This is a really good Nixon biography about the White House years. It's called One Man Against the World. And it pretty much sums up Nixon's thoughts about being Nixon. Everybody was out to get him. He couldn't win. He came up through the ranks. Nobody respected him for that. He couldn't trust anybody, even the people around him. He couldn't show any affection towards his family. You got him right here, and it kind of blossoms it out into how his foreign policy, how his domestic policy, how the White House years, and then Watergate, of course, were all treated by this man. And very complex character. I don't think anybody's going to understand him really until many, many years of history go by, and maybe they'll understand him. I don't want to understand him. I didn't like him. I think he ruined politics. End of discussion. But it's a good book about Nixon if you're interested in him. This is a sweet book. This is called The Golden Lad. And I don't know, a couple blogs ago I talked about Hissing Cousins, about Eleanor Roosevelt and Alice Longworth, who were cousins. And this is about Theodore Roosevelt and his youngest son, Quentin. And just a wonderful story about a father and his youngest son, and how he really loved his kids. That's one thing about Roosevelt, is that those kids, he didn't understand them. He didn't have a good relationship with Alice, but with Quentin he had the relationship that you would think that he had with all of his children. It's just a very sweet story. It's a very quick read too, but I really enjoyed this book. It's called Golden Lad. Okay, then we have this book, which surprised me in a way, because I always liked Lady Bird Johnson. I always admired her. For one thing, she had to live with Lyndon Johnson, but for another thing, she always was her own person. She ran her own business. She got her wildflowers and her nature stuff. What this book showed me is that these two were really partners, and that just like Nancy and Ronald Reagan, they kind of excluded everybody from their orbit except for the two of them. And she was his best advisor, and he was her confidant, I shall say. One of the things that really surprised me about this book about Lady Bird is that she was not a good mother to her daughters, Linda and Lucy. And they both admit it. And it was only after Lyndon Johnson died that she focused on her family and became this great mom and this great grandmother and a great-grandmother to her extended family. And once she couldn't focus on him anymore, she focused on her family, and then it showed her growth. But it was very interesting to find out how the two daughters kind of were shuffled around a lot when they were younger, and it's not all her fault, it's Lyndon's fault too, but that's the nature of the beast with politics. And speaking of shuffling a member of the family away, Rosemary Kennedy. Many people know the story about Rosemary Kennedy, that when she was born, there was a delay in her birth, and she lost oxygen, and as the result thereof, she was mentally challenged or mentally retarded as in her day. She was functional, probably they thought she was functional about 11-year-old, but as she started maturing, her father felt that perhaps she might get into trouble in the wrong way. She was leaving home at night, she was wandering the streets, she was doing all kinds of things. He put her in several different schools and different programs, but of course she was an 11-year-old trapped in a young woman's body, and in those days they really didn't know how to deal with that. So what happened was there was a new operation in the early 40s. The doctor said, do this. It'll calm her down. It'll make her so that she's manageable. It was called a lobotomy. And what it did was severely cripple her. And she functioned, and she lived until she was in her 80s, but she really was put off to the side. And her brothers and sisters were told that she went off to a school. And nobody really questioned it. And it really wasn't until after Joe Kennedy died in 1969 and Rose Kennedy brought her back. And Rose Kennedy didn't know at the time that the operation happened what exactly it was. It was just we're going to send her off to a school where she's going to help the school and be a helper at the school. And then Rose Kennedy discovered that, brought her back into the family fold, and by the time she died, she was a functioning member of the family and would come to events, and everybody loved Rosie. And she was the reason that Eunice started Special Olympics. Eunice always was close to her, and then got close to her again in the late 50s when she went out to visit her. And she was the one that got President Kennedy to acknowledge the mentally handicapped and handicapped in all kinds of ways. And he got some bills passed before he died. But they did this for their sister, but they didn't acknowledge their sister when the president was alive. So that's kind of sad. But she had a full life living in Wisconsin, of all places, with some nuns. Then we have Patrick J. Kennedy, and Patrick Kennedy was a congressman from Rhode Island. He's the youngest of Joan and Ted Kennedy's 3 children. He was a drug addict and I don't think he was an alcoholic. I think he had problems with alcohol, but I don't think he would call himself an alcoholic, but he was a drug addict. He also knew that he was susceptible to that because his mother and his father and both sides of the family had long strings of alcoholism, mental illness in there. And so he became sober. And the problem I have with this book is that sometimes when addicts get on their journey, they tend to judge others by their journey and not by the person. You shouldn't, he judged his mother very harshly in this. And his mother was treated very badly. There's no question that Joan Kennedy was treated very badly. But it wasn't for him to say that. I think he went overboard in that, in talking about his mother and his brother and his late sister to some extent, and especially his father, who acknowledged his problems and towards the last years of his life took care of his situation. But for the most part, it's kind of judgmental and it's kind of harpy, and I think he might have written it a little too soon in his sobriety. The Kennedy family and substance abuse, there's a long chain of stories about that. If you want to read good books that kind of deal with that and well written, I would recommend all of Christopher Lawford's books about growing up in the spotlight and becoming sober and then using your sobriety to work for good things. And I think Patrick's doing that, but I think it's a little too soon in his sobriety to really have written that book. And I do understand the upset, the pain that he's caused his brother and his mother. So now we're going to switch to something even pleasanter. We're going to talk about music. This is probably one of the best music videos ever. It's called The Kids Are All Right. It's about The Who. And with the passing of David Bowie recently, people are talking about the Mods. And this is the original mod band, The Who. 50 years ago, 1965, they came out. The Kids Are All Right chronicles that whole period of when they first started to about 1978 when Keith Moon died. Keith Moon wasn't dead when this came out. He died just before it was released. And so there's nothing really in there about him passing away, but it does talk about how they came up through the ranks and they kind of came through the door as the British invasion was coming to an end. And I think The Who, one of the great groups, and this is the official oral history, again, another coffee table book of The Who. I would have stopped it. I think The Who should have stopped in 1978. It's the same way with, I think Queen should have stopped when Freddie Mercury died. But they went on, and it talks about John Entwistle, who later passed away. It talks about some of the stuff that they've gone through. It also talks about their early days and what shaped them and why they got into a band in the first place, which is always fascinating stuff. Then we have a really good collection of stories about the folk music revival of the late 50s, early 60s that led to the California sound and rock and roll in the late 60s. Folk City. And of course, Dylan is always, the big preempt. But you also, there's Pete Seeger and Dave Von Rock and John Hammond and Phil Oakes and Carolyn Nestor, the Weavers. There's so many people, Joan Baez, Judy Collins, and then other people who you may have heard of, but you're not quite sure. Leadbelly and Odetta and all of those people who really should be acknowledged in the folk music scene too. And also a band that is kind of poo-pooed in some music things, which is the Kingston Trio. And the Kingston Trio led for a lot of people to come down to the folk areas in New York City in the early 60s and discover people like Bob Dylan maybe. But it's a good book. It's a long read. It's a very short amount of time, but there's a lot of stories that go in on it, and it's really interesting. I really like that. This is a very sad book. It's about John Curry. John Curry was an ice skater from England. He passed away from AIDS. It talks about being in that kind of situation of being an ice skater, world famous ice skater, and how that is all accomplished, and very interesting about how I don't understand a lot about professional skating. And skating's changed since he skated. I mean, they don't even do figures anymore at the Olympics. But it's very fascinating how that whole situation goes. And also talks about him and his journey of coming to terms with who he was and then coming to terms with dying. And always, when you see that kind of a story, it makes you think about your own life. Next book that really, really surprised me, that I really enjoyed, Illeana Douglas, talking about her life. And you would recognize her. She's been in a lot of movies, mostly character actress. And she talks about, it says, I blame Dennis Hopper, because he basically told her she should be an actress. Her grandfather was Melvin Douglas, who was an Oscar-winning actor. And her grandmother was the Douglas, and I can't now remember her name, Helen Douglas, who Nixon defeated in his first, we'll go back to Nixon, defeated in his first election. And Helen Gallagher Douglas is, I think, her name. And it talks about Hollywood, old Hollywood, young Hollywood, the avant-garde part of Hollywood, with the Hoppers and the Peter Fondas and Jack Nicholson and people like that. And it talks about working with people like Gus Van Sant and other directors who she really, really liked working with. And she doesn't really, I don't think she says anything bad about anybody. It's not catty, but it's very entertaining in the sense that it's about people. You know who they are, but maybe you don't know anything about them. You just see them as movie stars. And she talks about being an actress, and I think that's always fun to hear about set stories and how directors are different. And she talks a lot about that. So I really like this book, and it was surprising that I would like that book. Now, here is my favorite book of the winter. Carly Simon's Boys in the Trees, a memoir. If you like James Taylor, you can stop listening right now, because James Taylor comes off as a big-ass creep. I don't care. I don't like James Taylor anymore. I'm not going to listen to him anymore. He treated Carly very badly. He treated his children very badly. And I do realize that he was drug addicted. But come on, James. Let's give Carly... He, to this day, will not let his children give Carly his phone number. I mean, come on. Grow up. Anyway, Boys in the Trees. James Taylor is just a little tiny part of Carly Simon's life, and I'm hoping that she will write the second part of her life and talk about her second husband and being a grandma and that kind of thing, and the death of her mother. She talks a lot about her father. Her father was Richard Simon of Simon & Schuster. She talks about growing up in a complicated bohemian family. She had two sisters, one of whom is an opera singer, one of whom was Lucy Simon has written children's books, and she's written children's music, and she's performed on herself. She performed with Carly as the Simon sisters. Her brother's a well-known photographer, Peter Simon. So there's a lot of push and shove in that family. And her mother was this character who, very complicated relationship with her mother, and extraordinarily complicated relationship with her father. And her father died in 1960. I think Carly was 15 at the time when her father died. But the years before that were there were a lot of things going on in the Simon household that were not expected besides cocktail parties, which did happen, and famous people coming to the house. But it's a really entertaining story. It's about her way, you know, she's well known for her crippling stage fright. And she talks about why that kind of developed, and she talks about the people that she met, her romance with Cat Stevens, just all kinds of stuff. Carly's had a terrific life. If I could, you know, change places with Carly Simon, I would, because I would love to have her life. But I don't think she would like to give her life away. And it's just a great book. It took her a long time to write it. You know, she put a lot of love in it. She did it for her kids, which is one of the first things she tells you. And I think she did them proud. And I really think this is a great book. And I like Carly Simon even more after I read it. I was afraid to read it at first because I really do like Carly Simon as a performer. And as a singer, I own all of her records. And I was afraid that I would not like her anymore. Like, you know, when I read Belinda Carlisle's autobiography, and I don't like her as a person very much. I still like the Go-Go's, but I don't like her. But Carly, I still like and admire. And I think no matter how we view people, we don't really know them until they tell their story. And that's it for me for this time around. So I'll be back later with more books. I'm reading. You keep reading too. Thanks.